Hello, Wooster Mennonite Church, and welcome to week 17 in God's story of grace. This week, we will be reflecting on Esther and her role in saving her people during a time of pressure and stress. We'll be reflecting on our readings from the book of Esther from chapter 1 going all the way through chapter 7. And just to get started, I'd like to take a little bit of time to locate where we are in the biblical canon and in history for the Old Testament. And so just to get started, let's think a little bit about the events that have transpired to lead up to the book of Esther. So last week, we were in the period of the United Monarchy, and we were talking about David. And after David, Israel split into two kingdoms, and that was the era of the divided monarchy. Eventually, Assyria conquered the northern tribes of Israel, and they went into exile. And then after that, Babylon invaded the southern tribes of Israel, Judah, and conquered them. And then a number of those residents of those territories went into exile into Babylon. And that marked a period of exile. It was a difficult period. Some were still remaining in Jerusalem and in Judea, but most had been taken to Babylon. And then in 539 BC, Cyrus the Persian conquered the Babylonian Empire. And part of his decision in establishing his new kingdom and his new reign was to grant the Jews the right of return to their homeland. And so a number of the Jewish exiles from Babylon were able to return back to Jerusalem and to Judea. And those stories are narrated for us in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so we are actually just following those events in the story of Esther today. After King Cyrus, there were other monarchs, kings that reigned in the Persian Empire. And in the book of Esther, the king that is reigning in the Persian Empire is Ahasuerus. And historians have often said that the events of this book are referring to the king Xerxes, the Persian king Xerxes, but his name is listed in the book of Esther as Ahasuerus. But anyway, instead of our story taking place in Judea, around Jerusalem, with the Israelites who had come back from exile, we're actually looking at the Jewish residents who remained in the lands where they had been in exile in what came to be known as the diaspora. That's a Jewish community living outside of Judea, outside of Israel, historically, where Israel was located. And they settle in different locations. So for Esther and Mordecai and those who are also listed in our story today, they were Jews who remained behind and continued to live in exile and in this diaspora. So they live as a minority, ethnically, religiously, politically. The main religion of Persia at this time was Zoroastrianism, which is a form of monotheism, but there are a number of differences between Zoroastrianism and the religion of Israel. Zoroastrianism has this radical dualism, the struggle between good and evil. There's an emphasis on with their deity being some connection with the sun and with fire, and then more of an emphasis on those themes. And so for Esther and Mordecai, their religion would make them separate from and distinct from the culture of Persia. That distinction between Zoroastrianism and the religion of Israel. But then ethnically, they would be a minority. And so we kind of start the story realizing they didn't go back to their homeland. They stayed in there, figuring out what life looks like as a minority people in this other kingdom. But God is still present with them. Now, interestingly, I need to talk a little bit about the form of the book of Esther. And you might be like, Jacob, what are you talking about? The form of the book of Esther? Well, for Protestants and for Jewish readers of the book of Esther, the text that Esther is translated from is from the Hebrew text. And so I'm just real quickly going to hold up. This is a Hebrew Bible. And basically, the Hebrew text forms the basis of what we have in our modern translations. Like I have here the Anabaptist Community Bible. This is based off of the Hebrew text. And you might say, okay, well, why are you making a big deal pointing that out? Well, aren't all Old Testament books or most all Old Testament books translated from the Hebrew text? Yes, they are. For us in the Protestant canon, the book of Daniel has some Aramaic in it, but it also has Hebrew text. But the book of Esther is a very unique book. So it's translated from the Hebrew text in our Protestant Bibles, but in the Catholic Bibles and Eastern Orthodox Bibles, they actually use the version of Esther that is translated from the Greek Old Testament, referred to as the Septuagint. And so in English translation of Esther, like you might find in the New American Bible, which is a Catholic Bible, will have 6 additional sections to the book of Esther beyond what the Hebrew text adds. Okay, so that might start to sound confusing. So let me just quickly explain what those sections add to the story that we have. We have the same fundamental story that they're reading. All the details are the same. But these 6 sections add to a certain element of the text. And let me just try to quickly explain that. So in the Hebrew version of Esther, believe it or not, the name of God is not named in the entire text. The word God does not appear in the Hebrew text. So when we read the story, we see evidences of God at work, and God is present and acting on behalf of Esther and Mordecai. For example, you'll know in our readings as you go through that at one point, Ahasuerus has a dream. And in this dream, he remembers a kind action that Mordecai had done on his behalf. And that inspires him at just the right moment in the story to honor Mordecai in a time when Haman was planning to trap him and do something evil for him. Haman is the main antagonist in the story. Mordecai is one of the heroes of the story, who's one of the Jewish exiles who is settled here in Persia alongside Esther. Anyway, long story short, the story shows God at work behind the scenes in a kind of a quiet, subtle way, but it doesn't unpack for us the moments of the story where Esther or Mordecai might be praying to God or naming God directly. It shows the subtle actions, what Esther and Mordecai are doing, God's work behind the scenes. There is a moment in the Hebrew text where Esther asks Mordecai to invite the Jewish community to fast. And so we would assume as they're fasting, they're also praying. But it doesn't really go into detail. And it doesn't give us a big window into the internal life of Esther or Mordecai that isn't really unpacked for us as much. We have more the external view of what they're doing and saying. But the Greek text, what it does is it takes the Hebrew story and it adds some introspective elements in showing us an insight into who Esther and Mordecai are. It gives prayers from Esther and Mordecai. It gives a prologue and it gives an epilogue, which frames the story and more explicitly talks about God's action and activity in the story. So basically what we have is the Hebrew version that we have in our Bible was received into this Greek translation, the Septuagint. And so Catholics and Orthodox receive that, what we read, but then they read alongside it these additional parts that have prayers and a little bit more unpacking of what Esther and Mordecai were feeling, more explicit explanation of how God was at work. So it's kind of like almost an interpretation or a commentary of the book of Esther, a little bit of an unpacking, like an explanation for the community of the faith element. that gets integrated in with the text, and that's what the Catholic and Orthodox Bibles also include. So that's a very unusual thing to see in a scripture. This is the only book I can think of that has additions in that way that would set it apart from other books between it that would be different in the Protestant versus the Catholic and Orthodox canons of scripture. So I just thought that would be kind of a fun explanation. So just as we're talking there, as we're saying earlier, this story happens during the Persian period. Esther is an orphan, and her family member Mordecai has taken her under his wing to be a support to her. She comes into the story at an awkward time. King Ahasuerus is having this 6-month-long banquet, quite excessive and probably hard to imagine a banquet lasting that long. And at one point, he gets drunk during this banquet, and he wants to parade his wife, Queen Vashti, in front of his guests. He wants her to wear her crown, and she was a very beautiful person and beautiful woman, and he wanted his guests to recognize and see that. So he calls on her. But she knows the situation and what's been happening, that he's been having this large feast that's been going so long that he is perhaps unruly. And so she refuses to go in before the king. And this angers him. And essentially, what he and his court advisors decide to do is to strip her of her royal title and to give it to someone else. And that is where Esther enters our story. She is one of the young women that are selected to be brought before the king as he is picking his next spouse. And so right away, you kind of get a sense that the decisions of the king can be unpredictable and fickle, and it's hard to know always what will happen in his presence. And it kind of sets that tone as Esther comes in. She is a beautiful woman and gains favor from the king, and she's encouraged by Mordecai to go into the court, but to keep hidden her background, that she is a Jew. Mordecai says, don't reveal that. Keep that as quiet unto yourself. And so she enters into the court and becomes Ahasuerus' queen. She achieves this position, and so we're kind of wondering, what will Esther be like in this role? And we already saw what happened with Vashti. How will Esther navigate the whims of this king? But it ends up that this becomes a very precarious time for the Jewish people, because one of the king's high court officials named Haman, who gains favor from the king and a large amount of authority, becomes angry when Esther's uncle Mordecai, her uncle Mordecai, he will not reverence Haman, because Haman asks for people to bow and recognize him as he goes about the court and the royal areas, and he expects when people are in his presence to show deference and to bow before him. But Mordecai won't do that, and this angers him. And so Haman devises this plot to send out a decree in the name of King Ahasuerus that would essentially state that the Jewish people were to be eradicated all around the Persian Empire. And he picks a date when this is to happen, and he even gets the king's royal seal, and the decree is sent to all the parts of the Persian Empire, a huge empire that spans from Ethiopia all the way to the border with India. So this huge, vast empire. So it says in the text that this decree was translated into all the local languages of the different regions of the kingdom, so that they would understand what would happen to the Jewish people, all stemming back from Haman's anger at Mordecai. When Mordecai finds out about Haman's plot, he goes to Esther and he says, Esther, we are in trouble. We need you to go before the king and advocate for your people and ask for the king's help to reverse this decree. And Esther is concerned and afraid because she said, nobody can go before the king without being summoned. Now, if somebody goes before the king without being summoned and the king extends his golden scepter to that person, then they are granted clemency and no harm will come to them. But it's not a sure thing that the king will extend his scepter. So it's a very risky thing to go before the king in that way. And one could have to look no further than to Queen Vashti, who wouldn't go before the king and crossed him and was quickly removed. So Esther was concerned. But Haman says, Mordecai, her uncle Mordecai says, if you do not act, God will find another way to provide for his people, another form of salvation, but you and your family will perish. But if you act, perhaps God has placed you in this role for such a time as this. And the implication is that deliverance for all of her fellow Jews could come through her action of advocacy for them, of stepping up as that queen of the empire in this time, even though it's going against protocol and is dangerous and risky. And Esther has to think about that, and she decides that it will be very important if she is going to step out in this way for her fellow Jews to fast with her and to prepare. And that is such an insightful comment that she knows she's going to be doing something significant. And so she wants her fellow Israelites to go before the Lord and in this posture of prayer and beseech God's help. And so they are fasting. She asks for Mordecai to spread the word, and they're fasting. And then she decides to go in to King Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus sees her, and he extends his golden scepter. And she comes before him and invites him and Haman, that troublesome antagonist who has created this whole dangerous situation for her people, to a banquet that she will be putting on for her people. And the king and Haman agree. And when they come to her banquet, she reveals that Haman has devised a plot and even acted upon it with the king's own name and seal to eradicate her people. And the king is surprised and shocked. And he says, what are you talking about? How can this be? And she said, well, I am a Jew. This is my people. And Haman has sent out this decree against us that we are to be eradicated on this particular date. I believe it was the 14th or 15th of the month. That it can fall either between mid-February to mid-March in our modern calendar. But anyway, and then he turns to Haman, and Haman is completely flabbergasted and caught off guard. He was not expecting this. He didn't realize that Esther was a Jew. And so there's this great reversal, that the one who had plotted destruction and who had been conniving and wanting to create this trap for the Jewish people, he ends up being the one who is rejected and thrown out of the court and punished. And Esther and her people are then in the favor of the king, and Mordecai is brought in as one of the king's advisors, which is another great reversal, because all along Haman was trying to get rid of Mordecai, and now Mordecai replaces Haman. But the king says, under Persian law, a decree of the king cannot be undone. So I want to support you, but I don't know legally what our recourse is at this point. And Mordecai says, Well, let us send out an additional letter, an additional ordinance to the peoples of the empire, specifically stating that the Jewish communities can defend themselves and protect themselves on the days that were specified in the original decree that they would be attacked. And so the king gives that permission, and now Mordecai sends out these decrees, and just in the same language that was used earlier in the book, it was translated into all the local languages, just like Haman's had been, and all the peoples of the of the territories in Persia are able to receive and see this decree. And the Jewish communities are informed then. They know to be prepared and to defend themselves. And when the time comes, that is what they do. And they overcome anybody who tries to come against them. And this rescue is celebrated then with a festival called Purim or Purim. And this deliverance of the people in a time of great distress through that intervention of Esther becomes a powerful story that is told for generations, and is now in our scriptures and is celebrated liturgically in the Jewish community still to this day with the festival of Purim. It's instituted at the end of the book, and Esther is 10 chapters long. So as we didn't read these chapters in our section, we stopped at chapter 7. But as we continue to go through the texts of the book of Esther, we would have seen more about Purim and how it's celebrated. But it's an interesting story about God's deliverance, and we'll see in this pattern an echo of what we saw earlier when we were going through the book of Exodus, and when we thought about the Passover and how important it was for the Jewish people to remember God's action of deliverance on their behalf in a time of distress when they were a marginalized people in a foreign kingdom. And we see that pattern again here at the book of Esther, that this action of remembering what God has done to deliver his people as they were oppressed and in a foreign kingdom. It's repeated here, and it becomes part of that pattern of God's saving action on behalf of his people. So I hope that as we've gone through this deep dive into parts of Esther, and maybe just for a little moment, how there are two main different versions of Esther, this one that we read and then that slightly longer one, that it's maybe made us appreciate how all throughout the Bible there are stories like this of individuals who are willing to step out even though it's costly and risky. They're willing to step out in faith on behalf of others to try to help those who are in danger. And God sees that and honors it and acts on their behalf and reverses the situation in ways that are unanticipated and in ways that are saving and redemptive. And so as we think about the story, I hope that it will continue to inspire us as we work our way through the larger story of salvation in Scripture. Thank you again for going along this journey with me and for plugging along in this week's readings. I look forward to talking with you again soon about our next set of readings. And until then, goodbye.